In this video, we're going to discuss some concepts regarding sight reading. We ask you to sight read on snare drum, mallets, and timpani for your all-state auditions because sight reading is an essential skill for the performing musician, but it is a skill and does have to be worked on and practiced in order to get better at it. So in this video, I'm going to go through a snare drum piece and a mallet piece and talk about some tips and tricks for sight reading, and obviously you'll be able to apply that to timpani as well. Sight reading is an essential skill for any performing musician, not only because you will run into situations where you may be asked to cover a part and you haven't seen the piece of music before, but also as a way of working on your general reading skills, the ability to cognate a piece of music, to think about it, to be able to understand what the rhythms and pitches are, etc., and be able to play it as you're putting that information into your brain. So sight reading, very essential skill, but one that I think that percussionists find somewhat scary. So I hope this video will show you that sight reading isn't scary if you go into it with the right mindset and you work on it correctly. So a couple of things to think about as we start sight reading, and I've put a piece up here on the snare drum stand that I haven't seen before and a piece over here on the mallet stand that I haven't seen before. Here's the most important thing with sight reading. You have to practice sight reading every day, even if it's just for 2 or 3 minutes as part of your regular practice routine. Warm up with some technique things, sight read for 2 or 3 minutes. Doesn't have to be a lot, just a little bit. One exercise a day will pay enormous dividends, rather than, this is definitely not a skill that you can cram by sight reading for an hour. This is definitely something 5 minutes a day does a lot more benefit over the long term. Now, when you encounter a piece of music that you haven't seen before, such as the etude, the small little excerpt that you're going to get at your all-state audition, this is what you do. The first thing you do is you look through the piece really quickly, and you have about 30 seconds to a minute to do this depending on the instrument. And you want to look at a couple of key features. You want to look at the time signature and the tempo of the piece. And you can go ahead and you can, I'll do this on the page I'm not reading just so I will say I've done it. You can go ahead and touch the music. As long as you don't make any sounds on the instrument, you're okay to do just about anything you want. So what I do when I encounter a piece of music is I go through and I actually touch on the music all the things that I think are important, so that I make a connection with my brain that when my eyes see that, I know that that's something that I have to go through. So I've pulled this etude up. I'm going to do another one here in a second. I've pulled this etude up. I see it's in 6/8 and that the tempo is moderato, moderate tempo. That just sort of gives me a feel for what style the piece is sort of going to be, even though I'm probably going to read it somewhat slower. The next thing that I'm going to go through is I'm going to note all of the dynamic changes. So I'm actually going to touch them with my fingers. So I go through, here's a piano, here's a forte. Again, this isn't the piece I'm going to read, but I'll do this again in situ. Fortissimo, mezzo, piano. Here's a indication to play slower. And then a fortissimo at the end, right? So I'm actually going through and touching all these so that when I get to them with my eyes while I'm playing the piece, I remember that I touched them and that I assigned an importance to them in my brain. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm just going to read through all the rhythms really quick. And what I'm scanning for is, do I understand what all the rhythms are so that when I get to them I'll know how to play them? And then what I'm really scanning for is to find the most difficult measure of the piece. Once you find what you think is going to be the most difficult measure, either it's got the most rhythms or the weirdest flams on snare drum, or it has accidentals or the widest leaps, or a fast scalar passage on the mallet part. Once you identify the hardest measure, then you have to find the tempo where you know you can play that measure correctly, and that's how slow you go, right? You don't get, there's no points for sight reading if you read the whole thing fast and sloppy. What we want to hear is a correct interpretation and musical interpretation of the music the first time, which means you can go as slow as you need to play it correctly. All right, so as I've gone through here, scanning through again just real quick. Okay, so I've identified, this is 2 of the same bar here. I've identified this is the bar that's going to be the toughest for me in this piece. So I'm gonna take a couple seconds and give it a little bit more attention, make sure that I understand the rhythms, make sure that I understand the techniques. And now I'm going to think in my head, what is the fastest tempo where I know I can play that measure correctly, and then I'm going to start the piece at that tempo. All right, so as I'm going through on the snare drum, I'm looking through for ornaments. So we've already done dynamics. Then I'll go through again, look for ornaments. I see some drags. I see some flams. Crescendo here. A couple of these rolls have accents on them. I'm making notes of all these things as I go through, and I'm going to scan the piece 3 or 4 times in the course of the 30 seconds, looking for these various things. You don't want to try to get all of the information in your head the first time. You're going to have to look through the piece a couple of times, right? So I went through, I looked for time signature and tempo indications, then I went through dynamics, then I went through rhythms. Now I'm going through specific techniques. I see some drags, a couple of flams here, a couple of rolls with accents. I got to make sure that I catch this crescendo and decrescendo here in this piece, making sure I understand what these rhythms mean here. Have some accents here at the end that are different than the dynamic indications, so I need to make sure to pull those out. Right, so that's an example of going through a piece on snare drum and thinking about all the various things. Now notice that I have the music stand fairly high, so I don't have to lean forward and look at it. We're going to set that off against the approach for mallets in just a second. So I have a piece of music on the other page here. I'm going to go through my checklist. I'll talk you through my checklist as I go, and then I'll sight read this piece of music for snare drum now. Okay, so I see that I'm in 2/4 time. The tempo is allegretto. That means very fast. I'll probably play it a little bit slower since I'm reading this for the first time. 2/4 time signature. Looking through for dynamics. I see piano at the beginning, so I know I'm going to start soft. Crescendo and forte. Forte back to piano a couple of times very quickly. Then back down to piano. Then we have another longer crescendo, forte, sforzando roll with a decrescendo down to piano. Then crescendo up to forte. Now I go back up. Okay, taking a look at rhythms. No tempo changes in the piece. Have some 8th note rhythms, some basic 16th notes here. Then we have a couple of bars of 16th note triplets. I'm going to go ahead and scan through a couple more 8th notes, some chord notes with some rolls on them, some triplets with some flams, and then some syncopated 16th note stuff at the end. Okay, I think the bars with the 16th note triplets, with the dynamic changes, with the extreme dynamic changes from forte to piano, that's going to be the hardest measure of the piece for me. So I'm going to go ahead and work my way through the piece here and think about what tempo do I know that I can definitely get that correct. So, right, so I guess I'm thinking about here. All right, so I'll read this about here. Going back through, have some flams, right hand flams here, left hand flams here, soft roll, accent, another soft roll into a triplet, so I need to make sure that I think about the release of that roll and what hand it's going to be on. A longer roll at the end of a crescendo, and then a sforzando roll that decrescendos down to piano. Right, so I have to think about the attack and all that kind of stuff. Okay, you can read through rhythms with your sticks in the air if you want to make sure you get a sticking right for a rhythm, but don't make any sound on the instrument. All right, so it's been 30 seconds or a minute here, so I'll go ahead and read this now. When you get ready to start, you have your hardest measure of music. You know what tempo you can play that correctly off. Count yourself off in your head, and off you go. Whatever you do, don't stop. If you make a mistake, keep going. If you were in an ensemble situation and you made a mistake in the part, the conductor's not going to stop in the middle of a concert and go, or you're not going to stop the group and go, hey, sorry, I made a mistake. Can we start over again? No, the music keeps going. So the goal for sight reading is to keep going. Whatever you do, don't stop. Okay, so I have my hardest measure. I've played through some rhythms here, worked out a couple of stickings, and now I'm ready to go. Take a deep breath. Count yourself off in your head. I'll count you off out loud here on the video, and then off we go. 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay, and that's my piece. It's the first time I've read that. Now, if I go back and work on something, it's not sight reading anymore. You can only sight read something once. Again, 5 minutes a day. If you did that much sight reading every day, find a good snare drum book. The Mitchell Peters books are really, really good for this. Mitchell Peters, famous percussionist from the last century, has a whole variety of snare drum books on a whole variety of different topics. And you don't have to do a whole piece. You could just do 2 or 3 lines of music. Just something to get you to sight read every single day will pay massive dividends. Okay, so now let's look at the mallet instruments. On the mallet instruments, we're going to have all of the same things that we already talked about, but obviously we're going to have a few additional considerations since we're dealing with the pitched instruments. The first thing that you want to notice is that unlike the snare drum where I had the music stand up so I could see it clearly, and in an ensemble situation I would be able to see the conductor in my peripheral vision, on the mallet instruments we want the stand to be as low as possible so that as I'm looking at the music I can see the keyboard in my peripheral vision. Obviously we have a lot more targets that we're responsible for than on snare drum where you're going to drop the stick, you're probably not going to miss the snare drum, right? But obviously because we're trying to play right notes, then we have the music lower so that as we're reading the music we can keep as many of the keys as possible in our field of vision. So I have the music low here. I've opened up to an etude that I have not read before. I'll tell you what book it's from at the end because it's an excellent book for sight reading. So now I'm basically going to do the same thing, but with a couple of additional steps. Okay, so I've opened up here. The first thing I'm going to note, it's in 4/4, but there's no tempo indication. I'm still going to go fairly slow to make sure that I get all the right notes. The next thing on mallet instruments that you want to note is the key signature. So I notice that we have 2 flats. So I don't know yet if we're in B flat major or in G minor. I'm going to look at the first note and the last note. The first note's an F, the last note's a B flat, so I'm going to guess that we're in B flat major rather than the relative minor. But you won't be able to tell that just from the key signature. You have to start looking at the pitches. Okay, so I know we have 2 flats. We're in B flat major. The first thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to run through the notes in the B flat major scale in my mind, and you can play it in the air with your mallets, right? So B flat major scale has B flat and E flat. Okay, so I know basically the notes that I'm going to need, and I sort of highlight the notes in my mind so that on the keyboard those notes sort of jump out at me, and I know that those are the physical locations where I'm largely going to be working from. Okay, the next thing I do is I want to find the lowest pitch of the piece and the highest pitch of the piece. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put I'll put my mallets in the air over those spots. I want to place my body in the middle of that range so that I don't have to be reading here off the sides of my body. And I'm going to put the music in the middle of that range so that everything that I need to read this piece is all right in a line in one field of vision, right? So I'm going to go through here. Highest note is a G, so I'll use this G here. Lowest note's an F, so I basically need a ninth to perform this piece. So I'll place my mallets here. My body will be positioned in the center, which is basically C, and then I'm going to move the music so that it is also in the center. Okay, now it's time to start going through. Next thing you want to look for, dynamics, just as we said. No dynamics indicated in this piece. Okay, so then it's just my job to make sure that it comes off as a piece of music, that I phrase where I sort of phrase where the melody leads, and feel free to do a small amount of dynamics of your own in order to make this a musical performance. This is not meant to be mechanical. Sight reading should still be a piece of music. Okay. Mallet instruments, the next thing I'm looking for, accidentals, right? So I went through, I found my B major scale notes. Now I'm going to scan through, and again, use your finger, right? Touch the music. I'm scanning through. Oh, there we go. E flat in the key signature. Here's an E natural, right? So I'm going to make a note of where E natural is and the notes on either side so I sort of know what that melodic little bit is. Then we're back to E flat in the key signature. Great. Scanning through, here's an A flat. So we have flat 7 in the major key. Right, so I'm going to make a note of where that A flat is, and how we're getting to it and how we're leaving it. Okay, so I know I have an E natural and A flat. That's the accidentals I have in my piece. Now, I'm going to take a couple seconds and scan through the melody. And again, I'll I can stick this in the air as I go. In general, on mallet instruments, try to alternate as much as possible. Don't try to play 15 notes with the same hand. If you have two pitches that are two subsequent pitches that are the same pitch, obviously you can play them with the same hand unless there's a reason to alternate them. But you don't want to try to play everything with your right hand just because it's easier. You want to try to alternate. Don't beat into the bars. I know you're using your brain for reading the music and not thinking about the sounds you're making, but you do need to still try to play it musically, play off the keyboard, and make good sounds. So as we go through here, there's some repeat signs in this piece. I'm not going to play them when I run this through you real quick, just for time. There's some fermatas. I'm not going to do the fermatas either. Rolls usually won't be indicated on the mallet instruments. That's up to your discretion. There's a couple of half notes here that I'll roll, but in general, the fermatas I'll just play as normal chord notes and move through. And then I do have a note here that actually has a roll indicated, so I'll of course play that note as a roll, and a couple others. Okay? All right, so I've sort of read my way through. Now I'll go ahead and start. Here's the most important thing. Keep your eyes in front of your hands. Right? You have to be reading the music before your hands get to it. If you're reading what your hands are doing, then your brain is actually reacting, right? So if you want to be proactive, you have to keep your eyes 1 beat, 2 beats, a full measure, 2 measures in front of your hands. And again, the more that you practice sight reading, 2 lines, 3. I'm gonna read 3 lines right now. 3 lines every day for 2 minutes will pay off huge dividends over time, to the point where you can read entire phrases as you're sight reading them, because you're reading so far ahead and you're putting all that information into your brain, and then your hands are recalling it, right? But you have to keep your eyes in front of your hands. So in this case, I'm going to try to keep my eyes 1 measure in front of my hands. Obviously, you won't be able to tell while you're watching the video, but I'm basically, you have to be looking ahead, right? Here we go. I found the hardest bar, and that's the tempo I'm going to go at. 1, 2, 3. Here's the accidental. Oh, I played a roll on an E natural. That was terrible. That was absolutely a mistake. I did not mean to do that at all, but I kept going. I didn't stop and try to correct it, right? You gotta keep going. I got distracted. I did not keep my eyes in front of my hands in that case, and I made a mistake, but I recovered and kept the piece of music moving, right? So there you go, sight reading in real time. Okay, so use your finger, go through the piece of music, look for the things you need to look for: time signatures, tempo indications, dynamics, accidentals on the mallet instruments, hard stickings or rudiments on the snare drum, stickings, leaps, scalar passages on the mallets. Go through, keep your eyes in front of your hands, don't play faster than you can play it perfectly. And yes, I obviously made a mistake there. Other than that, practice just a little bit every day and you'll get so much better so quickly. For the mallet instruments, any flute or oboe book or violin book works. Easy method books work great for sight reading material. For percussion stuff, I really like this book. This is called Percussion Keyboard Technique by Thomas McMillan. This is a classic keyboard percussion text, and I just pulled up one of the introductory little exercises there to sight read today. There's another book that came out recently by a friend of mine named Chris Butler called Mastering Sight Reading for Keyboard Percussion. This is a book full of exercises for sight reading. And so what it has here, it has open note heads, so you can decide the rhythms and the time signatures and the key signatures for the etudes, and then you can read them in a bunch of different ways, and the text talks about how to do that. Highly recommend both of these books to work on mallet sight reading, and then of course any violin, flute, or oboe book, because those are in concert pitch, will work. For snare drum, I really like sight reading out of the Mitchell Peters books. A wide variety of them. Intermediate studies for snare drum, elementary studies for snare drum, all have tons of great. The Morris Golden book, Morris Goldenberg Modern Method for snare drum, all have great stuff for sight reading. 1 or 2 lines a day, 3 or 4 minutes a day will pay huge dividends over time. Right? Sight reading doesn't have to be scary. You just have to work on it a little bit. Good luck working on it, getting the skills, and good luck on your All-State auditions.